Thank you all for joining us today for our office hours and some resource review. We also have a guest speaker on today. So, Montez, if you would go to the next slide, we can see um, what our agenda is for today. As usual, we have our fun icebreaker to get us going in the morning. And then we have Beth Kallestad from MnDOT joining us to give us some updates on what MnDOT is doing and some ways that we can be engaging with them, as well as I'll be covering some resources that are available to you through the Charging Smart program. And then we'll follow it up by time for you all to ask questions of us and of each other to get some insights into maybe some things that you've been working on. Um, so Mumtaz, if you would go to the next slide, we'll go to our icebreaker. If you haven't already, if you could change your name to what community you're representing and the state that you're from, just to kind of help people have context for where you're at. And then in the chat, go ahead and answer the question that is, has your community ever held a ride and drive event or maybe a similar event to a ride and drive? And so if your community has done that, go ahead and throw it throw it in the chat and let us know what you've done, or maybe you're planning one. Um, I know I see some people on the call that I know who have held an event. So looking forward to hearing about that. Great. And while everyone is working on making those changes, I will say that I have organized two events. I want to say one in Roseau, Minnesota, so way up north, and then one in the metro area in partnership with an electric utility. And they were both great events, and I do love attending them myself. So, um, Moontas, if you would head to the, oh, and I am seeing that Beth did put that when she worked for the city of Northfield, they did put on a ride and drive event with local partners, which is great. We love to see local partners being involved in those sort of events. Moontas, if you could go to the next slide, I will um, introduce our guest speaker here today. Beth Kallestad is the Principal Sustainability Planner for the Office of Sustainability and Public Health at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So we're really happy to have her on today. She'll be giving a brief update about the work that MnDOT is doing and an assessment that's going on at the state, as well as how we can be involved in that. So thank you, Beth, for being on today.
Thank you so much for having me. Okay, I'm going to attempt to do the screen sharing. It worked earlier when we tested it, so um, we'll see how this goes. I've gotten so used to Teams that I have forgotten my Zoom skills. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. Big fan of, of the work that the Great Plains Institute does, and appreciate how you support cities and communities. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Funds, and then additionally a little bit of a planning project that we're doing here in Minnesota. And I know we have folks from some other states on the call, and if you aren't aware yet, the NEVI formula funds do apply broadly. So each state should have some NEVI dollars, and so that might be something that if you you could go and then research some more about if you aren't aware that what your particular state is doing. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I was under the impression that this was just a Minnesota group today, so a few of the slides I'm going to skip over since they may not be as relevant. But anyhow, so this we're going to just talk about how we're implementing our NEVI funded program, and then the engagement pieces that'll be happening later. So for those that may not be aware, NEVI is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, and it is part of the federal bipartisan infrastructure law that came into it was approved in November of 2021. And essentially the main focus area for the NEVI program is to build out a fast charging network across the country, primarily on what are called alternative fuel corridors. And for the most part, those are interstate roadways, but each state nominates the roads that they want to be alternative fuel corridors. So some states have a lot and some states have fewer. In Minnesota, we have Interstate 94, 35, and recently added I-90 across our east to west across our southern border. So a couple key points with this funding and this rule is the stations need to be located no more than 50 miles apart along those roadways. They need to be no more than a mile driving distance from the exit on the alternative fuel corridor, and there need to be a minimum of 4 150 kilowatt fast charging ports at each site. That's sort of the initial phase of what the dollars need to be spent on. And then if there is funding still available to each of the states, that can be used on other roadways. And at that point, we can start to look at level 2 charging stations as well. Each state, it's called a formula funded program because each state receives a proportionate amount. I don't know what the actual formula is, but for Minnesota, we're receiving $68 million over federal fiscal years 22 through 26. And so we just had our 2024, the 2024 plan updates were approved. So states should have access to the funds through what's now federal fiscal year 2025. A key thing for us, at least, and I think every other state is operating essentially the same way, although except maybe Rhode Island. Rhode Island does own their stations. That third parties are essentially owning, operating, or maintaining the stations, and that needs to be for at least 5 years. The stations are not going into the DOT rights of way. We're looking essentially at this private public-private partnership type of situation. And while that doesn't seem like a big deal, it was a really big deal in getting the program stood up and how that all works, because it just isn't how normal federal highway transportation projects get funded and carried out. So there's a lot of process pieces that we encountered some challenges with and have worked through. And I can tell you the other states are in similar situations. And they're all doing it slightly different ways. So your state may be implementing it in a different way if you're not a Minnesota group. So we're into our second round right now. Our first round, we awarded 13 locations, 12 got through to contract. These are along I-94 and I-35. And then we just opened our second round. So here's the map of the state of Minnesota. You can see our alternative fuel corridor shown there in the blue lines. And the sites that were awarded in round one are an orangish color. And then the sites that are eligible for round two funding, it's sort of a darker blue dot, is showing the exits where we will accept applications, and then they're in different little cluster groups. Our intention is to award one location per cluster, so there's 14 total clusters. If we can get all of those done, then we should be able to move toward that approval from federal highways for the build out status. But as you can see, looking on this map, there's a lot of Minnesota that is not covered by those charging stations, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But if anybody's interested, we do have a recorded informational webinar on our grant webpage. The grant round is open for about 2 more months, and we have a question and answer update page there. And so you can see there's the link to our NEVI program website. And I will just say before NEVI, oh, sorry, that's sort of the schedule, but probably kind of irrelevant. Before NEVI, we did not have a plan in place in Minnesota to locate and or fund electric vehicle charging stations. It was essentially a private market development that was happening. And so with the federal dollars, MnDOT started to think some more about this. Our initial round of locations was based on trying to meet those requirements to build the alternative fuel corridors. And so now, as we're doing that build out, we're also thinking about what comes next. How do we get coverage around the state. How do we help to end range anxiety, accelerate EV adoption, which is listed in we have what's called our state climate action framework document. And then at our DOT, we have another plan, our statewide multimodal transportation plan. And both of those have EV adoption. It's the same goal, but EV adoption goals are within those. So really trying to think about, okay, what comes next? So we are working with HDR Consulting to help us kind of assess existing market conditions, both for vehicle adoption and charging station locations, and then to be thinking about where does it make the most sense to try to locate stations and sort of what power levels, what numbers of charging ports in rough geographies. We're not going to get down to exact locations, but at least along certain corridors and roadways, where do we want to put things? So that's the project we're working on right now to gather that information. We're getting very close to opening a public engagement round where people can learn a little bit more about the project and then weigh in a bit to help us, verify like, yeah, these locations make sense. This level of service kind of makes sense. And then we'll move into having a draft report. And one thing I'm really excited about with this project is we will have an online mapping tool dashboard that can be used by other entities. So this is a MnDOT project, but it's much more than MnDOT that's going to be needed to build out this EV charging infrastructure. So we have our sister agency, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, that administers the Volkswagen settlement funds. And they're going to be using this on their last round of granting that'll be happening next year. We know we have our metropolitan planning organizations and our cities and counties that might want to be part of this. We don't know at this point in time what's going to happen with the Federal Highways Charging and Fueling Infrastructure discretionary funds. We will have to wait and see if that program continues to exist. But if it does, that's a place where cities and counties can apply for dollars to install charging. We know that the utilities and that private investors and foundations in some locations, or charitable nonprofits are doing a lot of work around trying to get charging infrastructure installed. So this will be a tool that can be used by all of those entities. So we're pretty excited about that happening. So for those that are interested, we have MnDOT has this platform called Let's Talk Transportation. So we have a page that's set up there about this project. There's not really much on it right now because we're kind of in between some engagement opportunities, but there is a mailing list that people can sign up for if you're interested to get updates as things are happening. We will have this self-guided information page to give info about the project, and then there'll be some still in development, but it's essentially a mapping activity and a few questions that we'll be asking folks. And really, we greatly appreciate anybody on this call that's interested in taking part of that, but also sharing with your networks. And at least for the Minnesota folks, if anybody would like to have MnDOT come do a presentation over the next couple months about this to encourage folks to learn about it and how they can be part of it. Please reach out, and if we can make that work, we're happy to do that. And this is my email. If anyone has questions, wants to follow up, happy to have some conversations about this work. And I'm going to stop sharing. Let's see if I do that right. Okay, great. All right. So
Thank
yeah,
you,
happy
Beth.
to answer questions and see how I can be useful.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Beth. So
Yeah.
if people want MnDOT to speak to their community, is it
Mhm.
you that they should be reaching out to, or is there
Yeah.
a spot
Yeah.
on that
Yep.
website?
Yep. Yeah. It would be me. Mhm.
Fabulous. Are there other questions for Beth? Otherwise, Beth, thank you so much. We'll be sharing this recording as well as the slide deck out with the people on this call as well as the rest of our group, and encouraging them to participate in the survey and whatnot. So
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. If
All
you have a
right.
question for Beth, you can either unmute or put it in the chat. Also, Beth, I'm sure if people have questions afterwards as well, you'll be open to fielding those too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to share my experience on the ride and drive side of things too.
Yes, well, that is so. If you are willing, I do have a
Yeah,
question for you
sure.
about specifically the partners that you worked
Hmm.
with.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
can you share a little bit
Yeah.
about that and how that
Yeah.
went?
Yep, absolutely. So I used to work for the city of Northfield, program coordinator, I think was my title, but I worked on their climate action plan implementation was one of the pieces. And electric vehicle charging is certainly part of that. So a couple of partners that we had, our Rotary Club in Northfield has a very strong interest in climate related items and Rotary clubs around the country, the world are starting to add these Rotary climate action teams, and funding through Rotary International is available for environmental projects. Anyhow, so they were a strong partner. They actually helped to fund three-quarters of the cost of the two charging stations that we installed. We also had our community foundation was a part of it, Northfield Shares. Excel Energy had a presence. And then in terms of the vehicles, we ended up working with, and this was Northfield Shares made this initial connection, but an organization called Recharge Minnesota, and it's I can't remember if it's actually Recharge America is their name, but then they have a strong presence in Minnesota and Massachusetts, um, or and maybe other places too, but I know that was their initial reach. And so they did the coordination with the vehicle dealerships to get the vehicles there, because just from an insurance standpoint, we didn't want people like bringing their own cars and driving. So we did have, and I think there was a Twin Cities EV club that showed up and just parked their cars and so we had parked cars that people could go look at. And then there were a few dealerships that brought cars for people to drive. And, um, and then there were also, they had other like electric yard equipment and e-bikes, and we had a food truck and, different things. But I really do think their model of the getting butts in seats is highly effective. So if the more you can do that, the better.
Indeed. Uh, do you know how far in advance you started planning for for the event?
Hmm. Um, Probably 4 to 6 months. I think we did it 2 years. The first one was at one location, and that worked out okay. But then we were able to get a different school. There were two different schools. The second one had a little bit more space and was a better for the ride and drive experience because it's nice if you can find a space where it's you can get a little bit of open stretch of road. So you can, because honestly, so as an EV owner and driver, one of the key selling points is that acceleration off the block. And if you can get going, that people are like, whoa, this thing moves. Um, it, so if you're looking for where to put your location, think about your driving route is a key thing.
Yes, well, that was perfect because someone did just
Yeah.
ask
Oh, good.
about
Yep.
the space.
Yeah, yeah. So we did it, and I've also been at one, and I will say from having a sort of a booth perspective, I went to one that was hosted by a local utility up in northern Minnesota, and they had the booths for the most part inside, and then they had like the ride and drives, the driving part was outside. There's some benefit to that, and if you have really windy conditions or cold, um, so think about what your space is. But yeah, I think it's nice to have other like community partners that are working in the electrification space there. Um, people do have to wait a little bit of time sometimes if you have a crowd to do the driving. So it's nice to have other stuff to keep them busy and invested in what's going on. We also did do one with Recharge, or I attended one that they did when so as MnDOT, we've been showing up at some of these events too, where they hosted it at um, a business that builds charging stations. and people got to take a tour of so it's more the workforce side of things. So there's some different kind of approaches to partners and things that you can look at.
Well, and that's interesting too, is that maybe reaching out to your state DOT or other
Mhm.
state entities that might be doing work might want to
Yeah.
come and talk about what they're
Yep.
doing or give information to community members.
Yeah. I mean, I love to go to those to get input on our planning efforts because you've got, those EV drivers will definitely tell you what they think. So those are good. Yeah.
Great. Well,
Did I answer all
fabulous.
the questions that were there?
Y- Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Well, and so we have it's that Beth was a perfect segue because we are going to be talking about doing a brief overview of Ride and Drive toolkit that Drive Electric Minnesota has put together to help communities kind of think about what they need to do um, to uh, to plan one of these events. And it sounds like from the chat, it sounds like people are thinking about ride and drives coming up. And so, Moontas, if you could go to the next slide. Drive Electric Minnesota, as I mentioned, created a toolkit for um, for doing a ride and drive. It helps walk you through all the different considerations that you might need when you're thinking about hosting one of these events. And so the picture on this slide is that first page of the toolkit, and it has the table of contents on there, so it walks you through what materials you might need. And it also kind of helps you think of things in the timeline of what do I need to do before the event, what do I need to do during the event, and what needs to happen after the event is over. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see that the checklist that this toolkit is formatted into has three different columns that it uses. And the first column off to the left there is kind of the action item or the task that needs to be done. Um, and then the middle column is talking about best practices that Drive Electric Minnesota has come up with, uh, or considerations or different ways that you could do something, and kind of walks you through what those might be, as well as linking to resources or templates that have already been created. For instance, on this slide, it says create surveys, and Drive Electric Minnesota has created a survey template that you might want to use, or so it links to that, which is nice. And then that third column all the way on the right is uh, an area where when you download the template, you can you can be adding your own notes to this. You can be saying who is responsible for doing this task. Um, and I think this is especially helpful for if you have multiple groups that are working on this or outside partners. This is a great way to keep that all organized. So I'm not going to be diving into like the nitty-gritty of how to do an event, but just keeping in mind that this resource does exist. Some things that they suggest that you should do before the event. The main thing is having an initial planning meeting. That said, I think 4 to 6 months that they were working on planning it. I think at minimum we say 8 weeks to get the planning process started. One of the things I did notice in the chat, somebody mentioned about working with dealerships, and that is the event is around is around having dealership cars there for people to test drive. So it is a trickier piece of it because oftentimes dealers don't know what cars they're going to have on the lot. Um, so far in advance, but it's always good to be talking with them, letting them know what's going on, and getting their I guess buy-in that they'll be at the event, but then just kind of keeping in mind that you need to be flexible. And we also like to encourage to have different forms of vehicles there. So maybe if your community or city has EVs in your fleet, planning to have those vehicles there that people can at least look at. As Beth mentioned, there's kind of like the showcase event where maybe you can invite community members who own EVs to come and park their vehicles, and then they stand by the vehicle and ask questions that participants have. So we like to have kind of lots of different things going on so that maybe if a vehicle doesn't show up that you are expecting, there's other fallback alternatives. And then, as Beth mentioned as well, having um, other electrified items can be really fun. Especially people love seeing the electric bikes, but also lawn equipment, and even depending on like what the context is, we've done some in northern Minnesota where ATVs are really popular. So electrified four-wheelers or other utility vehicles like that were fun to have at the event because that's what community members are interested in seeing. So this next slide shows things to do during the event. And so it is broken down into like before, during, and um, after. But within that, the checklist is broken down into kind of this is what you should do 8 weeks in advance. This is what you should do 3 to 4 weeks in advance. And this is what you should do 60 minutes prior to starting the event, and that sort of breakdown as well to kind of give you a blow of where you should be thinking of doing these different actions. Um, what else do I want to say about this? I will say one key thing is during the event, Muntas, if you go back to the during the event, one of the key things is when you are at the event, and your dealerships are showing up or the people with vehicles are showing up, that you should be communicating with them about what the expectations of the event are. You should be talking about, showing them where you have that driving route mapped out and letting them know uh, where they should be going. And then also, if you want anything recorded from the event, like oftentimes um, people like to have recorded how many test drives were done. And then there's always the person that's driving the vehicle, but then also sometimes there can be other people in the car that aren't necessarily doing the driving themselves, but they're still having the experience. So maybe you want to know how many people were in the car, that sort of thing. So making sure you're communicating that clearly with the dealership or anyone else that's at the event ahead of time is really critical, because kind of during the event things are going and happening, and making sure that you're setting time aside for having clear expectations ahead of time is important. Um, and then I will say that if you are planning the routes, having right-handed turns are very helpful. So then you're not waiting a long time for taking left-handed turns. So doing all right-handed turns can help speed things up. And I say that because one time we had a ride and drive where um, it's really great. The dealerships were talking a really long time with the community members, and then the ride and drives were taking longer. And so making sure that you take that into account when you are planning for how long is each test drive going to take. Maybe you give like 5 minutes for kind of getting people situated and talking about the car, and then 5 minutes for the actual test drive itself, so that you can plan about how many test drives can be given at a specific time. So this is all talked about in the the checklist. Um, so I just wanted to, it seemed like there were some questions and thoughts about that. So I wanted to call that out specifically. And then Mutas, if we go to the next slide, talking about what to do after the event, making sure that you're thanking everyone who came, or participated, or volunteers who helped out, especially if you're inviting community members to showcase their own vehicles. They're taking time out of their own day to help out with your event. And so, um, making sure that you thank them and acknowledge them for their help, as well as compiling anything that like any of those surveys that you had during the event, or if you want to post survey after the event, um, making sure that you're compiling that as well. And then I do always encourage you after the event to sit down with the planning group and right after it say what went well, what might we change, and make sure that you record that, because then if you're going to do a similar event in the future, you can have that in your back pocket, to make sure that each event is successful and better than the last. So if we go to the next slide, I mentioned kind of an initial meeting. We at Charging Smart created a worksheet that you can download as well or make a copy of. It's just a Google document, so you can make a copy of it and use it for your own uses and type in it. But it kind of asks those questions that at the initial meeting you should be thinking about, like who is our audience? Um, where do we want this? What time do we want this at? Are there partners that we should be thinking about, that we should be engaging that aren't here, and that sort of thing. So it walks you through all sorts of different helpful questions that maybe you didn't think that you should be thinking of. And then the next slide, we always like to talk about um, being creative and thinking about ways that you can customize this sort of event to your community. Like I said, maybe you know that your community members really like uh, ATVs or snowmobiles, and so you find an electric version of that to have at your community event. Also thinking about the time of year that you're having it. GPI and Drive Electric Minnesota, we partnered to have a ride and drive in Ely, which is in northern Minnesota, and we held it in February. And we do think it is the first that we know of winter ride and drive event that was used as a way to help kind of overcome hesitancies that people might have in driving EVs in the winter. And it was a really successful event and people enjoyed it. So maybe thinking about alternative times to summer and fall that might help showcase EVs within your community. And then, as Beth mentioned, and I've mentioned a couple of times, but I just really want to bring home, is think about other partners that your city or community can be working with to host an event like this, like your utility, like community groups. In Minnesota, we have a really strong group, like a Facebook group of Minnesota EV owners that we always reach out to say, hey, are you interested in bringing your EV to this event? And they're always really, really willing. Universities, if you have a university in your community, could be a good partner. Um, and so I will say that if you do have an electric utility involved in your event, you can get additional points in this Charging Smart program. So keeping that in mind, and they're just a really good resource for community members to be in touch with as well, especially if they have charging programs that are available that they can talk about at that event. And then you can always pair to, you don't just need to have a standalone ride and drive. Communities have often found success if it's paired with an event. So maybe you're having a sustainability fair that it could be paired with, or maybe you have kind of your community days like Apple Fest or Panaprog or whatnot, that you can pair the event with, where people are already coming and already going to be at that event, and so it's a good addition to getting visibility. If we go to the next slide, we always like to talk about how we can incorporate kind of making sure that EVs are available to everyone in our communities. And so this is just an example of, if you are hosting a ride and drive event, how you could earn EVs for all points as a part of that. So for instance, maybe you could earn 5 points if you communicate about the event to community members who often face barriers to benefiting to EVs. So maybe that means that you're making sure that you're posting flyers in areas with multifamily housing or where you know there's a high population of renters, or maybe you're advertising on different radio stations or having flyers or your promotion in different languages, that sort of thing. And then kind of scaling all the way up if you have and are working with partners who represent um, those populations that might face more barriers to benefiting from EVs, and they're actively involved in planning the event and co-hosting the event, then you could earn 20 EV for all points as a part of that. And if we go to the next slide, Muntas, there's just some other things that I always like to talk about when you're thinking about accessibility in your event. Thinking about those partnerships, as I mentioned, uh, who you can be reaching out to make sure that your event is as accessible and making sure that it's speaking to all the different demographics in your community, as well as when you're doing that engagement, thinking about who is hearing about this event and making sure that you're communicating the event in multiple different ways, different avenues, so that you get as much participation from all of those groups as you can, as well as thinking about like the location of your event is really important and the time of your event, making sure that the location is a place where people feel safe and welcomed in coming, as well as having it be at a time when maybe like we kind of like to do kind of a longer event where it could hit different groups of people who might be able to come at different times of the day. Um, so all sorts of things to think about. And this, like I said, isn't a exact walkthrough, but some high level pieces to be thinking about when you are organizing an event like this, and letting you know that this toolkit and worksheet are resources that are available to you. And Muntas, if you go to the next slide here, um, there's a ride and drive toolkit and the worksheet that are linked. I'll put that in the chat as well. But we also have some more in-depth webinars that are available to you. One that is kind of walking through that hosting a ride and drive, and it gives you kind of more of the nitty-gritty details. So I would recommend watching that if that's something that you're interested in, as well as we do have a webinar about community engagement that could help you think through um, the different partners that you could be engaging in and how best to be communicating with your community members. So with that, I think that's my last slide. Um, beyond, I am remembering now that I do have a slide, Moontas, on if you go to the next one about an electric school bus grant. So it's a slight right, a hard right-hand turn, if you will. But I did want to let people know about an electric school bus grant that the Minnesota Department of Commerce has open right now, and applications are due on December 17th, and that can be stacked with the EPA's electric school bus grant as well. So I will share the RFP link in the chat as well, but just wanted to highlight that before moving on to questions and open office hours. So I do think I did see some questions coming through in the chat, but I did not. I'll read them now, but it's, did anyone run into insurance issues with the dealerships doing test drives? That's a great question. I think in that, in the toolkit, there are some suggestions about that and some guidance on that. I will say that we've not had any issues with, as long as you're talking about it with the dealership ahead of time. Um, all of the um, all of the events that I've been involved in, the dealerships are are pretty open to it. We do have a waiver as well that we have people sign when they're signing up to do the test drive before they can get in the car. Um, so, so it is something that needs to be thought of, but we've been able to work with dealerships on that. Mackenzie, I see that you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. First off, also great for sharing all that information. It's super helpful in preparing for these events. And thanks to Beth for the real world experience as well. But I just wanted to follow up on this idea of insurance issues. We have GPI works with states, communities in other states as well. And we have seen a few folks, I think in Louisiana, ran into this insurance issue. And so they kind of rescoped their event to be a slightly different uh, type, slightly different structure, and they called it a show and tell. And they had their local community members bring their own personal electric vehicles and show them off and offer rides if they were comfortable, or offer that folks could sit in their personal vehicles to still kind of get the experience of the differences between them and the conventional offering. So that was one way that we've seen folks circumnavigate if needed. We've also seen folks in different states scope these events as petting zoos, where they have vehicles that can be observed, sat in, but not necessarily moved. So if you do, as Rebecca said, we haven't run into this issue in Minnesota yet, but if you do find yourself experiencing difficulties, there's still ways to put on events that give people exposure to the vehicles that can be really useful to them without the need for the insurance for operating a motor vehicle. So just wanted to offer a couple examples.
Yeah, thank you, Mackenzie. And also, I think I have heard one example of where they could get in the car and ride around in it, but they weren't necessarily driving it. So that could be another alternative as well. But yeah, so if you have any questions for us or maybe for others on the call that is related to ride and drives, love to field those. But also, if you have other things that you're working on too that you would like to have input on, either from GPI staff or GPI staff or fellow participants on this call, uh, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat or unmute yourself. And Sarah, yes, I apparently am not good at multitasking, so I will do that right now. Give me a moment. I will be silent as I put it in the chat. Okay, so I put the toolkit as well as the um, that worksheet that I was talking about in the chat. I will also put the Minnesota RFP for the clean school buses in the chat as well. And then the final thing that I'll put in is um, a link to Drive Electric Minnesota. This is the page, their web page, where they have the Ride and Drive toolkit that you can download, but they also have some other good information on there as well. Um, so I would encourage you to look at that. One of the things that they have is some like facts, like kind of trivia questions about EVs that I have found is fun to put at a table when you have your ride and drive. We have like a little circular, like one of those spinny things, and whatever question they land on, then they have to answer it and get a piece of candy or something. So kind of a fun way to keep community members engaged. Because as Beth mentioned, sometimes there can be wait times for as you're waiting for your test drive to happen, um, and so having other things that community members can do while they're at the event is fun to keep them at the event, keep them engaged and happy. Great. Well, this is an open time. So if you have questions, let us know. Also, if I will encourage you to, if there's further questions that you have about ride and drives or any other of the Charging Smart actions that you might be working on that you want input in, our team is always available to you to help out with that. So please don't hesitate to reach out and ask those questions individually as well. And yes, if there are no questions, we can end early as well. Or if you prefer to have a breakout room as well, we can do that. So we'll just hang on for a couple more minutes. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, we'll help you out. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.